Very nice. Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining. We'll begin promptly, but we'll give it a minute or two just to allow some more people to enter the webinar. But thank you all so much for joining. Or maybe not good morning, but it's morning for me. Yeah, thank you for all the people who've joined in the last minute. Thank you all very much for joining. As I was sort of saying, I think we may begin potentially around now. So as sort of very formal, thank you very much all for coming. Welcome everyone. And yes, this is our first tax talk of our new series that we're launching. So thank you all very much for coming to the first one. So I am Lara Frass, and I'm a policy economist in the Tax for Growth team at the IGC. And I'll be chairing today's lecture, which will be focusing on Daniel Overbeck's and Alia Lungu's paper, Bargaining Over Taxes. So the study analysed Zambian turnover tax after sort of underwent a structural change in 2017 and 2018. So turnover taxes are very widely popular in a lot of middle and lower income countries, as they allow smaller firms to contribute towards the tax system by designing a tax that's a bit more simpler to understand. However, analysis on turnover taxes is somewhat limited within the academic sort of world, and this paper is a really good example of how turnover taxes actually work with taxpayers and when it comes to their collection. So to teach us more about this, we are privileged to be joined today by Daniel Overbeck from the University of Mannheim, by Alia Lungu, who is the Assistant Director in Statistics at the Zambia Revenue Authority, and by Chene Mukumba, who's the Executive Director at Tax Justice Network Africa. So we will start with a presentation of the study by Daniel and follow up by a panel discussion afterwards, and then we'll have a 20-minute Q&A at the end. So, but before we get started, I just have some housekeeping items to quickly go through. If anyone would like to act as a live participant during the seminar, meaning that you have access to video and microphone, and you can verbally interact during the Q&A section, please virtually raise your hand, and Greg will randomly select you to join for the discussion. For other participants, please type any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. We'd really like to encourage you to submit them at any point during the discussion, and it'd be really great if you could include your name and organizational affiliation when you write a question. You can upvote a question by clicking the thumbs up icon. I'd also like to note that we're recording all lectures in this series, and the recordings will be available on our website. And there'll be a brief survey following today's lecture, which would be very lovely if you could take a minute to fill it out, as it's very important to us to receive feedback. So without further ado, over to Daniel.
Yes, thank you so much. So hi and welcome everyone, also from my side. Thanks so much for organizing this. Leah and me, we feel very honored to be opening this new webinar series on tax talks, which we think will be very interesting. So thanks all of you for attending, and I'm very happy to present this paper, which was my job market paper, and is entitled Bargaining Over Taxes, and joint work with Leah, who's also a panelist here. So in lower income countries, as we know, state capacity is typically low. Now, what this entails in part is that formal institutions often struggle to execute basic governmental functions effectively. Now, instead, to compensate for this, informal institutions play an essential role in the economy and everyday lives of people. So, for example, public goods provision, credit markets, as well as insurance systems at the local level have been shown to be partly organized outside of formal institutions, but rather through informal interactions between citizens or between citizens and bureaucrats. Now, on the tax side, however, there's really very little we know about the relevance of such informal institutions. And while they might be usually associated simply with detrimental corruption, they may also simply help to alleviate frictions in tax compliance, and thus are very relevant for government revenues, which continue to be very low in most developing countries, as most of you are certainly aware of. So in this paper, we ask, how do informal interactions actually shape the official tax system? And the setting we study is the taxation of small firms. Now, small firms are crucially important for developing countries as they comprise up to 90% of the taxpayers and also economically contribute up to 40% of the GDP in an average low-income country. Our paper uses novel administrative data on the universe of small firms' tax filings from Zambia, so the turnover taxes. And additionally, we conduct our own survey of more than 500 of such small firms. So from the data, we go to establish novel facts, which will be inconsistent with conventional models of tax compliance, but we show how to rationalize them with a new theoretical framework we propose, and ultimately, empirically, as well as theoretically, establish bargaining over taxes as an important mode of tax compliance. Now, let me lead you directly to the key empirical fact we find in this paper, which is about bunching around tax bracket thresholds. Now, we studied this during the time 2017 to 2018, when the Zambian tax schedule featured different tax brackets, and each of these thresholds imply different things or different incentives for the firms to behave in a certain way. So here's a snapshot of how the tax schedule looked like during that time. In particular, the tax schedule featured exemption threshold. That means that firms that had turnover below 3,000 Zambian kwacha within a month didn't have to pay any taxes. Now, then several tax brackets applied. In particular, when the firm had turnover above 3,000, it paid 3% above of monthly turnover above that 3%. Once the firm crosses the threshold of 4,200, the tax liability starts with 225. And then again, 3% of monthly turnover exceeding that 4,200 apply in terms of tax liability. Now, crucially, what happens at this threshold at 4,200, the tax liability actually jumps from just 36 to 225. Right? So 36 is the maximum you pay in the lower bracket, 225 is the minimum you pay in the upper bracket. So there's this discrete jump in tax liability. And now thinking about the tax liability as a function of turnover, you see in panel A here, we observe that this is indeed a linear function, and then there's a discrete jump at the threshold of 4,200. Turning this now into disposable income, so thinking about what does the firm have after paying taxes, this induces the drop here in disposable income, what we would refer to usually as a notch in the tax schedule. Right? So disposable income drops at the threshold. Now, such a notch has a clear implication of how we would expect firms to behave around the threshold. In particular, it induces a dominated range. And if you look in panel C, plotted the dominated range here in red, and it's strictly dominated for a simple reason, because after tax income, so disposable income, is strictly larger well below the threshold or well above the threshold. But within all of this red region here, firms are losing out on after-tax income. Thus, we would expect firms to bunch, so to strategically locate below the threshold. So we would, in the distribution of firms, expect bunching, so an excess mass of firms locating just below the threshold. And then you would expect a hole in the distribution above the threshold, because you would expect all firms choosing the low payment side and go below the threshold, and no one choosing the high payment side. So now, given the data that we have from Zambia, we can check how do things look like in reality, how do firms behave. So what you see here is the empirical distribution of tax returns around the threshold. In particular, this is a binned distribution, which basically means that, for example, the first point here tells us, so how many tax returns have been filed that report turnover between 3,200 and 3,300. So when we go to the threshold at 4,200, we do indeed see strong bunching below the threshold, so that's what we would have expected. However, when we now go above the threshold into the dominated range, we still see a strong accumulation of points. So if we go back right from the theory, we would have expected a hole in the distribution. Here we still see a strong accumulation of points. So this is exactly the data mass point we would have not expected. So we can even make this argument more formal and compare this to a counterfactual distribution, where here we simply take the distribution of firms prior to the tax reform, so before the tax brackets were introduced. And we do indeed see that here there was no bunching above the threshold and at 4,200 and 4,300. There was no bunching when we go to the pre-reform data. So this is indeed significant bunching, so strong response to this threshold. And here we see bunching above the threshold. So let me lead you now to the second and key empirical fact, which is about bunching around tax liabilities. Now here we go back in time. So before the tax brackets were introduced, actually the Zambian tax schedule for turnover simply featured a flat rate of 3%. So irrespective of the size of your turnover, you would pay 3% of that in terms of tax liability. So this fact is about bunching at round number tax liabilities, right? So this is important to note here. This is not about rounding the turnover. So you don't just state round numbers in taxable income, but you actually target round numbers in tax liability at the payment level. So the Sandwich setting is very nice for this because if you think about it, a linear tax schedule is always bijective. So what this means is that any tax liability X you would want to reach is always reachable by simply reporting X divided by the tax rate. So here X divided by 0.03. So a simple example is here, if a firm would target a payment of 30, what it would need to write down in the tax return is 30 divided by 0.03, so 1,000. That means in order to get a tax liability of 30, it needs to declare income of 1,000. But now also, when a firm targets a payment of 100, what it would need to write down on the tax return is this very odd number of 3,333 and 33 cents. So with this example, I can show you how we back out the bunching at round liabilities, which is not driven by rounding turnover because it actually implies odd turnover. And here's how this looks like graphically. So here again, the yellow line features a counterfactual distribution. So that means counterfactual where we assume, okay, let's see how would the distribution look like if firms do not round their payments, if they would only round their taxable income. And the black line again is here the actual data we observe. And you have this very strong spikes at amounts like 1,666 because it gives you a payment of 50. That means many firms are actually rounding their payments. The same holds true for when you go to 3,333 because it gives you a payment of 100. Doesn't stop there. This also holds for 200 or 250. Yeah, so really rounding happens at the payment level rather than the taxable income level. So given the somewhat puzzling evidence, we thought it makes sense to get a more qualitative view on how firms are behaving on the ground. So we conducted a survey towards the end of 2023 of actual turnover tax firms. So here's a picture of how such a survey situation typically looked like, and this also gives you an idea on how many of these firms operate. So these are often small-scale operations, right? A lot of them are wholesale retailers. So overall, we had 517 respondents, and this was done through an external firm. So we got a grant from the International Growth Center to conduct the survey, and then we hired an external firm to actually run the survey. Finally, the sample we had was quite representative for the population. So, and we think given the small sample size of 517 in the survey, compared to 5 million in the administrative data, we think we did a very nice job in getting a representative sample of firms. So the main result we get from the survey is that discussions and agreements over tax payments with tax officials is widespread. So depending on the sample, 42% to 55% state that. So here are the exact numbers. So we asked the firms whether the firms or the firm owner discusses the payments they're going to make with some tax official before actually filing their income, right? So discuss the payments before, and then they simply file whatever they need to file to arrive at the payment. And in particular, that's the numbers. So 42% state that in the overall sample. When we go back to the firms that were actually active during the notched schedule in 2017 and 2018, this number even increases to 55. And a substantial share of these state that the reason for doing this is to discuss and then agree on actual payments. Okay. Interestingly, we also asked the firms on their perceived probability of being audited for tax reasons, and we observed that firms that do discuss the payments are less scared of being audited, which suggests that these discussions might serve as a preemptive measure to forego formal audits and simply clarify things in advance. So let me very briefly now speak about the theoretical framework on how we economically can think about this bargaining over taxes, why it makes sense, and what it may imply. So starting from the standard model of tax compliance, we can ask, how does bargaining make sense? And there are two straightforward reasons for why this might be the case. First of all, the taxpayer dislikes uncertainty through audits, right? So firms might be risk averse and simply being scared of being audited because they're unsure what will come out of this process. They might not be able to prove what they have, or they might also have actually a strategy to be cheating. So overall, what the firm does is kind of maximizing an expected utility, right? But then this uncertainty is something that the taxpayer may dislike. So given this dislike, we can ask, what is then the maximum amount of a certain payment the taxpayer would be willing to make? So this implicitly characterized in the model, we will label this as TF. So it basically says that the taxpayer is willing to pay more than its expected payment if it knows this payment will be for certain and they won't get any trouble. On the other side, there's a tax authority, and the tax authority actually incurs cost of auditing, which might be substantial for very small, quite unorganized firms. So then, given that there's this cost, we can ask, what is then the minimum amount of a certain payment the tax authority would be willing to accept? Again, we characterize as TG and show that if the tax authority knows that's what I'm going to get for sure, right, then I don't need to audit, so I can save on these audit costs, and thus the tax authority will be willing to accept less than its expected revenue in the standard audit tax compliance setting. So therefore, any payment between TG and TF are here Pareto improving. That means better for both parties. And in the model then, there's bargaining over the surplus TF minus TG. So now, how does this bargaining idea here feature into the bunching we observe, and how can it rationalize this? Well, with a flat tax rate, as we just discussed, right, any agreed upon payment capital T can be implemented. So in principle, they bargain and discuss and then agree on the capital T of the payment they're going to make. So once they have this, you can go back and write in the tax return Z equals to T divided by the tax rate. So therefore, you can agree on all these round figures such as 50, 100, or 150, which is what we just saw in the data, what happens a lot. Now, crucially, what happens when you have different tax brackets? So with different tax brackets, some payments can actually not be reached anymore. So for example, if a firm writes down in the tax return, it has income of 4,200, it has a tax liability of 36. When it writes 4,201 cent, it makes a payment of 225. So therefore, you cannot implement a payment, a tax payment between 36 and 225. And thus, when you would actually like to agree on numbers such as 50, 100, 150, these are not feasible as tax payments anymore. So therefore, firms that end up within this region in the bargaining process would then end up either below or above the threshold. So either would say, well, just 36 or 225, well, 36 might be a little bit too little for a firm that usually paid 150 because that's what the bargaining outcome. So they might opt for 225, others might opt for the lower payment. And therefore, we would observe bunching actually just above the threshold in the dominated range. So beyond this rationalization, we have a few predictions from the model, which also lets us speak about welfare and policy applications. So in particular, the model implies that the bargaining here yields a net tax revenue gain for the tax authority, and on the other side, the uncertainty reduction in a low information environment for the firms. So therefore, bargaining clearly is welfare improving here. However, one condition is that state capacity needs to be low. So that means it's welfare improving as long as state capacity is low. And also then can explain why bargaining would occur in a low income setting, but not in more developed economies where audits, for example, are much more efficient. Importantly, also, I think it has three implications for optimal policy. In particular, it shows that usual optimal taxation concepts we might have might be very misleading in this context when speaking about turnover taxes in small firms. We showed that there's a fundamentally different interpretation of the tax data than what we usually would expect. Secondly, the tax schedule itself seems to be much less important, and thus nitty-gritty tax reforms, as many governments do, might be not as effective as one might think. What might be more effective might be actually increasing third-party reporting, which could be done, for example, by reducing the VAT threshold. That might be something that leads to better bargaining outcomes, but then also in the long run would actually make bargaining obsolete. So thank you very much for your attention. This is my email address, but I'm looking forward to any questions or comments that might come up as of now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. That was a really good presentation, and there's so many interesting results to sort of come from this study. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear from Eliane from Chennai as to your initial sort of thoughts after seeing the presentation. So maybe Eliane, if you'd like to sort of start off, I know you and Daniel worked on the study together, but we'd love to hear as to what your initial thoughts are when you saw the results and what policy implications there might be as a result of it.
Oh, thank you. I hope I'm audible. Yeah, I'll speak not as an author, but someone from the tax administration. I know so the results were quite puzzling. I think when we started to do the analysis, I think he mentioned about bunching, because I mean, if you're familiar with research on compliance, you notice that most findings show that the bunching usually occurs at least below a certain threshold. But in our case, it was quite surprising that most of the bunching was above threshold, even as little as 1 cent. Like you declare your turnover above, maybe let's say it's an extra unit in Zambia is in way, but it's equivalent of a cent to a dollar. And then by implication, you pay more. But then it's a bit counterintuitive. Ordinarily, you would expect someone to declare less of their tax liability, but it was a very different thing that we saw. And the other thing was on the round figure tax amounts which are being paid, 50 kwacha, 100 kwacha, 200 kwacha. So that was a very surprising thing. So obviously, when the survey was conducted, I think it just sort of opened a can of worms, and then it's something that I got to understand. Obviously, there's some at least of informal interaction that happens between tax authorities and taxpayers, at least in low capacity settings like in Zambia. So it was just very confusing at first, but that's a reality on the ground. And obviously, when it comes to policy formulation, these are obviously kind of things that are sort of not taken into consideration, but to a large extent, I think they affect the interactions between the state and the taxpayers. I think those were my initial thoughts on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that definitely does make a lot of sense, that it's a bit puzzling and yeah, having to go backwards and figure it out. And similarly, sort of, Jen, I'd be really interested in giving your experience at Tax Justice Network Africa, what your initial thoughts were as well, and how it ties into your work.
Yeah, so first of all, a huge thank you, Daniel and Laia, for the report. I found it really, really interesting, and I completely agree with you, Laia. I found that bunching, particularly just over, to be quite curious. It'll be interesting to unpack that a little bit, I think, at some point. But with regards to the study, sort of overallly, I think it provides some important insights into how tax compliance functions, particularly in low capacity states. Such as Zambia. And I actually feel that this study would probably resonate in a number of other low capacity states across the continent. I think one of the key takeaways was that tax enforcement is often shaped by informal negotiations, right, rather than sort of strict rule-based compliance. And I would say this is something that we've seen, particularly with our national members that are working in low capacity states across African countries, particularly where there's sort of low administrative capacity. And there's some level of discretion in tax collection, right? And this is something that, we work a lot with our members, sort of interrogating a bit. I think from a specific tax justice perspective, I think it raises both interesting opportunities and concerns, right? So on the one hand, I think the study suggests that informal bargaining may be almost an adaptive response, right, in low capacity environments. Allowing tax collection to happen, to function, despite what might be institutional weaknesses. However, it does highlight, in a sense, a potential risk of inequities, right, where potentially more influential or more well-connected taxpayers might be able to negotiate better outcomes, right? Whilst others that are particularly smaller businesses or those with less access to tax officials might end up paying disproportionately a bit more, right? And of course, at TJNA, we advocate for tax systems that are transparent and fair and progressive. And so this for us is something that was, a red flag, when I was reading this research. And so it really, really underscores the need, I think, over time to strengthen tax administration, to reduce this discretion in tax collection, and really move towards more automated and predictable systems. I think one of the things that for us when we were reading it was it's quite clear, right, how and why this type of working has found itself within particularly sort of low capacity states. But it's definitely not sustainable in the long term. And I think it really showed that there is a need for us to start to strengthen our tax administrations, right? So that this is something that we are moving away from, but really sort of helps address particularly the much more important urgent sort of revenue collection needs, right, of low capacity states. And then I think as I wrap up, I think it also helps show where African governments should be focusing their tax collection efforts. And so I think overall, while ensuring that small businesses are taxed is important, and I think this is what the study can helps us unpack a little bit. I think the bigger concern in light of the work that we do, sort of remains around the potential undertaxation of sort of larger corporations, right? These much more influential ones that I was referring to a little bit more. And so addressing these larger issues, I think, would really go a long way, right, in strengthening sort of overall domestic resource mobilization as a whole.
Yeah, no, it is very interesting. So focusing on the taxation of big sort of corporations. And I think as you sort of mentioning about justice, I think it'd be really interesting to hear from all of you. Obviously the tax did introduce these brackets and it sort of comes across that it was an aim of sort of equity behind it. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear from all of you as to your own experiences as to why turnover tax might have been targeted in the first place to try to make it more equitable, and how this study sort of sheds light on maybe some of the challenges associated with some of that. I don't know if anyone would like to, Aaliyah, if you'd like to maybe start with some of your own experiences with ZRA, maybe.
Okay, thank you. So ideally, one of the core functions of tax obviously be behind besides the obvious revenues is equity, to ensure that there's a fair distribution of resources. So this policy change was done with that in mind, because what we do at ZRA is we give three categories of taxpayers. There's the small, medium, and large. So the thing for consideration, it's in terms of annual turnover. So if you are above a certain threshold, you are given certain classifications. So I'll just focus a bit more on the small taxpayers. So if a business has annual turnover of up to 700,000, they're regarded as a small taxpayer. So regardless of your size, within that bracket, you're charged a flat rate. So obviously someone who has 20,000 and someone who makes annual turnover 600,000, they're definitely not the same. So in the spirit of equity and ensuring that, so this system introduced graduated rates so that it becomes more progressive. Those with a higher turnover pay slightly more, and those with a lower turnover, obviously, they pay slightly less. But we saw from the study that this policy change, despite it having good intentions, it had unintended consequences. It created room for bargaining, this strategic bargaining, arbitrage, and things like that. So it's really it's a bit of a puzzle sometimes how tax systems sort of operate. So maybe the thing that is usually missing in our systems is, as much as we make these policies, they are not really anchored on the ground realities, and also the interactions, the consultations, because you see more often than not sound political. Most of these policy pronouncements are just made without general consultations from the public. So what we've seen in this paper is just an example of how, no matter how good a policy is, if there's no general consultation from the affected taxpayers, and transparency, let me just say transparency is not, it's not transparent. So these are the consequences. It creates unintended outcomes. And I think the paper just brings out unpacks some of these issues. I think that's my quick comment on that.
Yeah. So if I could just add one thing as we speak about the like progressive versus regressive outcomes. Actually, this tax schedule, when you take it, it's actually regressive within each bracket. So that means that the larger firms actually have a lower average tax rate than small firms. And I think regarding this turnover tax, in terms of, you're right, like Shina made a great point in terms of domestic revenue, resource mobilization. Big firms are, of course, much more important, really. But then in equity, and this is just like simply just most firms in the world are taxed like under turnover tax, if you think about it like this. And I know that thinking about this might be not as important because you always think about the revenue, but then it has huge implications for welfare of people. So that's really important. And that's why I think your work at the Tax Justice Network is so important, actually also thinking about these reforms, but because I'm pretty sure that, I mean, Elia hinted to this a bit, but also my conversations with the ZRA was like their initial thoughts on how the brackets were decided and how this was done was not like super well through and not really founded. So I think that's where the Tax Justice Network comes in, and I think it's also oftentimes random. I know that Kenya changed their turnover tax like 5 times within the last 3 years or something, which is good for research, but I'm not sure how. So that's why I just want to add that in particular this reform was actually making the tax get regressive, not progressive.
Yeah. No, I completely agree, Daniel. So I think so there's 2 points. On Elias' point, we always promote for consultations, public participation to take place and inform, right, the decision making, because ultimately at the end of the day, I think those that are being most affected by that would have most insight, right, into what works best, but then also particularly when thinking about it from a welfare perspective, right, that information you can get directly from them in order to help you arrive, right, at ideally the tax system that you want to put in place. But then, Daniel, I agree. We tend to push back as an institution around turnover tax. I think you do note that it's something that's employed across the world, but it has significant regressive measures. And in our interactions, particularly with a number of small businesses through our national partners, this is something that's really come to the fore, right? It's not really a tax that is made on the basis of profitability, right? So there's always a chance that a potential business didn't make profit, but made a certain turnover and is now finding themselves in a position where they need to pay tax, right? And that has implications not only on the business growth itself, right, but also, like we mentioned earlier, just on welfare. And then I think, as you mentioned, this for me was quite an important point, that at times you actually tend to find a high effective tax burden on smaller firms, right? Again, sort of really double clicking on that point around a regressive tax burden and the implications that has, particularly in businesses that we're trying to support, right? And so I think all of that are considerations that need to be looked into when thinking through this type of work.
Yeah, no, I think all of those are very good points, and definitely like consultation is something that I think everyone sort of is more or less on board that it's a good thing to do, and yet doesn't necessarily always happen. But I think it was very interesting what you're sort of talking about yeah, sort of lower firms maybe having to pay a large tax burden. And one of your sort of policy suggestions at the end or like next steps could be to maybe expand transparency and potentially even VAT. And I think it'd be very interesting to sort of hear from all of you as to sort of your opinions about that and what might be some of the considerations at play. So I don't know. So for example, Aaliyah, like what might be some of the practical considerations that the ZRA might face at sort of trying to increase transparency within the tax system, especially aimed at smaller firms?
Sorry, the network glitch, just the last part of it.
Totally fine. I was just sort of wondering, might there be any practical considerations that the ZRA might face with trying to expand, maybe us trying to decrease the VAT threshold, or maybe trying to expand or increase transparency more broadly within the tax system? So from like a practical perspective.
Oh, thanks. So at the core of tax administration is digitalization. So as much as possible, we want to reduce the physical interactions between the tax authority and the tax-paying public. I mean, regardless of size or the type of taxes that we're looking at. So for example, like reducing the VAT threshold, it would essentially mean most small businesses obviously register for VAT, which firstly is a good thing for the tax authority because that allows us to have access to more information because, VAT collects data about buyers and sellers. So that sort of gives us an enhanced oversight in terms of the transactions that are happening between small taxpayers, because small taxpayers, large taxpayers, there's a lot of interaction and it sort of gives us an oversight. But then you have to look at the practical realities of it. So turnover tax is a less, I would say, tedious tax. It just requires one to have a sales ledger, a sales book, oh, in a month, I sold so much and then apply a flat rate. But for VAT, there's all these complicated record keeping that you need to have. You probably need to have someone with a sound or at least basic education of accounting. But then in the context of small taxpayers, that's not usually the case. So if someone is, if you subject small taxpayers in the bid to obviously improve transparency in terms of information, it may create a burden or a strain on them because some of these tax functions would require extra resources. So you need to hire an accountant to do the things for you. You need to have a laptop to do these things. You need to be connected to a system to connect to the tax system. So all that translates into high compliance costs for the small businesses. So what that would do in the end is it may either stifle their growth or practically just drive them back into informality. So while it's on one hand, there are opportunities to increase transparency in the system, but we have to look at the practical realities. So maybe in order to do that, I think there's need to, for example, like just massive education, just to agree with what Chinay was saying, massive taxpayer education. You need to interact a lot, find out what their challenges are, subsidize certain things that will probably allow them to comply with taxes. And obviously that will take care of the technology integration I was talking about. But most importantly, all these changes need to be done in phased manner. Something that is done at the beginning of the new year, this is a policy, it always has unintended consequences. So I think it's a balance between the resourcing, capacitating the small taxpayers, because in the end, I think that will improve greater transparency, but it's something that we have to be very cautious about. Yeah, I think that's my quick comment on that.
Yeah, it'd be great to also maybe hear from you, Daniel. So obviously, like there are these practical considerations, maybe expanding VAT, but from a researcher side, it might probably improve the quality of the data that you have. Would that be something that, you might think about? I think you're muted.
Yeah, so basically regarding third-party information, and that's what VAT would bring us, right? Of course, like it's two things, right? You will be able to tax on profits, on value added at least. So that kind of would make it more equitable, and you don't pay on anything where you actually had more costs than sales. On the other side, among researchers, it's pretty clear that VAT is beneficial because it increases third-party information. So basically, there's also a bit what we try at the end of the paper, like going forward and in terms of policy, what modern governments, modern meaning for example in Europe, so have just more information about these firms. So basically, it's much harder for a firm to evade for barbershop in the UK, because basically the government already knows 90% of what they're sold. So there's not much room for evasion, also not much room for misinformation here. So that's why it's just important that the reason for this is it just makes audits much more efficient. And at least one angle one could see this bargaining happening is because audits are also costly, and it's kind of not clear what will come out of this when you actually audit a small firm, right? But then when you have third-party information, this just becomes much more efficient. Now, we state that basically this comes with countries developing state capacity. So again, also with the VAT in developing countries, as actually in a current study by Leah and me, a follow-up study on the VAT shows, there's also many problems with the VAT. So basically, what basically this shows also is that increasing third-party information is good for VAT, but this also comes hand in hand still like with economic development. So it doesn't come just like this, and it's not that the resources are just available to implement VAT for everyone. However, I want to say that I think in some cases, particularly in Zambia, I do think that there is room for decreasing the VAT threshold. So it is quite high in some countries, actually. It's not that you just excluding the very small firms from VAT, but that's at least my feeling that there might be, you might seriously would want to think about expanding VAT to some extent. And then also technology just expands very frequent at a very rapidly among small firms also. So I think there might be room for expanding VAT, at least to some extent.
And Jenna, do you have any sort of final thoughts on sort of trying to increase transparency, whether it's via VAT or some other method, as before we go to the Q&A?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what Elia and Daniel have said largely. I think with VAT, again, speaking from a tax justice perspective, it would potentially be much more progressive, right? As compared to turnover tax, largely because it's on value added, right, rather than actual revenue. So I think from that perspective, this is something that I think if there's a way to work towards, we would encourage governments and revenue authorities to head in that direction. But of course, again, from a tax justice perspective, a lot of our thinking is to make sure that even as that's being employed, it needs to be very well designed, right, so that it's not disproportionately affecting particularly sort of lower income businesses, etc. But largely agree with what Elia and Daniel have said.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your interest. I feel like this has been a super interesting discussion. I think now it's time to go to the Q&A part of our talk. So for those participating live, please raise your hands and we'll bring you in for your questions. And we have some questions in the chat which we can also address. So we have a question in the, oh wait, my mouse has gone crazy. So we have a question in the chat regarding the trade-off between sort of balancing equity and simplicity in tax systems. And the question sort of states that it seems that there's not really that big trade-off that can be interpreted from this study. And do we think that as economies tend to grow, when do we think this relationship will continue to hold true? I think maybe Daniel might be best placed to answer that question.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of simplicity, if I understand the question correct, it's what we can learn from this paper about the trade-off between simplicity and equity, right? So I guess in a bit that is sure this trade-off, but so actually I think Chenna would be the expert on on equity and simplicity, but I'm just going to keep it short. I think my view on this would be that from this what really shows in the paper is a bit that these systems for the small firms, they're nearly informal firms. So also the way that taxation works is in a kind of informal way, and basically how the tax system is designed in particular doesn't really make much of difference. Again, let me highlight the Kenya example, who change all the time the turnover tax system, which might just have no effect because in principle things are just clarified in different ways. So, but then maybe that's even again a question, but I was just thinking that equity and simplicity a bit goes hand in hand. If you have a simple tax system, it's more easy for smaller firms to actually also comply. So in that sense, I think a more simpler tax system to some extent would always make it more equitable. But maybe that's a conjecture Jenna needs to follow up on.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, but I think one of the things that keeps ringing in my mind, and this was the point that Elia made, right? That the bunching isn't happening under, right? It's happening both below and above, right? So I don't know that necessarily we're seeing simplicity sort of resulting in equity, I think from this paper, right? Because in a sense, sort of similar sized businesses are paying, vastly different amounts, right? So I'm actually not sure. Right, what a simplicity dotted line equity conversation could look like in this paper. But definitely overallly, I think if we look at this particular conversation around turnover tax in general, I think we do see that, right? Like I mean, I've already spoken to why turnover tax can be seen as regressive, but it's simple, it's easy, right, for small businesses to put in place. And I think the question was, as businesses get larger, do we start to see a bit of a shift in that trade-off? And I'm actually not sure. I think particularly drawing from that paper what that answer is. But it should be, I think, the case in general.
Yeah, no, yeah. Thank you both for your answers. I think the next question is from Fabrizio Santoro from the ICTD. So the question sort of states that turnover tax can still be quite manual, and in other African contexts, it's been fully digitalized. And so the question states, do you have a sense of this strategic filing behavior with income taxes that are already filed electronically? Yes, and on a separate note, what is the role of tax agents and preparers in this context? I can read the question out again if needed. And I think maybe Aaliyah, would you like to answer that one? Or maybe Chennai actually, potentially, because if you have a more country experience, more countries.
Would you mind repeating the question?
So the question is that oftentimes turnover tax collection is still quite manual, while in some other contexts it's been fully digitalized in some other African contexts. So the question states, do you have a sense of this strategic filing behavior with income tax already filed electronically? And are for eligible firms for the full regime? Yes, what are the control groups? And on a separate note, what is the role of tax agents and preparers in the context of digital versus manual filing?
Yeah, I think Elia would be best.
Okay.
So I could also maybe jump in, like, at least from this setting. In principle, it wouldn't matter whether in the bargain, when you just discuss, you can still clarify things in advance and then file electronically. Right, so at least if you have this interaction before, so if firms don't know what to do, so they go and discuss the payments, even though they do it electronically, the actual filing later, it's not decisive here. So, and this is also, I think, something I want to highlight, that you could also think, okay, this is just about manually and just about simplicity of the taxpayers, but I think that's something we really try to address in the paper, that the bunching responses really cannot be driven just by these things, that it's manual or it's simple, but really this bargaining needs to happen in order to make sense of the data. So that's there. On the other side, the tax preparers, I think my understanding is a bit that, again, here, these might just be the persons, if a tax preparer, in particular, these persons might be paid to actually go and discuss about the tax liability. So if you have someone in the middle, these might simply be the person that goes and bargains without actually being the firm owner. So so again, here I think that just might be the middleman, and I think even those guys, they might be actually paid to do this, so they might be even more involved in this bargaining process. That would be my take on this.
Thank you. So I think our next question links to sort of the behavioral science approaches that could be tried to make it easier for firms to pay the taxes that are due and sort of increase revenue for government from a researcher at Cambridge. So that might also be an interesting, yeah. Is there anyone who particularly would like to talk about potential behavioral science approaches to make it easier? Or if not, I can pick. Potentially, Dan, maybe Chennai?
No, not on this one.
Okay, fair enough.
I
Yeah.
mean, it could be that so when behavioral science, I guess, like nudges in that sense, right? You could push people, you can even make it more simpler. But again, this so it could be that you just say, okay, either you pay always just flat amounts, right? You pay this, and this, and you can just kind of sort into that, and you give some nudges or some incentives of why firms should choose a certain tax bracket. But again, the nice things of behavioral science, you can make it easier and nudge things. This might again lead, I think, to more regressivity in the tax system when you have flat tax payments, for example. So that would be my take. But it's a tough question. Yes, I agree.
Yes, and I think we have a few more questions that are directed, I think, potentially at Daniel as well. So we have one from Zevdu from the FAO from Ethiopia, who asks if the study considers how the inflation absorbs the exemption threshold or the adverse effects on tax brackets, mentioning that they think the tax bracket should be indexed by the inflation rate.
Yeah. No, the short answer is it's not indexed by the inflation rates. And again, as this is about we think that most of these payments and the declarations are not really reflecting precisely true turnover. I think inflation really isn't the matter here, and the tax schedule was exactly like this, with exactly the payments and the thresholds throughout 2 years, irrespective of any inflation. So this does not play a role here.
Yeah, just to quickly add on what Daniel was saying. So the turnover thresholds, as a matter of policy, I think we look at the nominal turnover, as opposed to looking at the. I know the picture sort of changes when you index for inflation, but for tax administration purposes, we focus more on the nominal revenue, which is why sometimes tax performance, I think you really have to be careful when you're looking at nominal figures, because inflation pushes up the prices. For example, like for VAT, it may create a false sense of our performance when actually it's just the prices that have driven the tax rates up. So maybe just to quickly answer and just agree with Daniel, it's we didn't consider inflation in the analysis. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we have another question on I think again, this is for Leah and for Daniel. So on the sort of potential missing real behavior within the data. So the question points out the data only looks at 2017, 2018, and that we might be missing some more behavior within there. And the data sort of is admin data, and then you sort of compares it with the survey. So might that be like a factor? And then it also asks if the results can be generalized to other countries in the region, and if bargaining increases compliance for small firms, and if that's just the collusion between tax collectors and large firms could also lead to tax evasion or underpayment. So yes, I feel that's almost like 3 questions. So there's a data question, there's how does it generalize to other countries, and then a question on bargaining, increasing sort of compliance, and the difference between collusion. So the difference between bargaining versus collusion.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for this question. I mean, to everyone, thanks for engaging. So to the first question, no. So we're not missing real behavior. This might be 2 years, but it's actually 24 months. That's how you should think about it. And if you see like in the paper, which I encourage everyone to read, of course, we really show that this behavior is pretty consistent across 24 months. So there's a lot of data points actually involved in the figures I just showed you. It's not just 2 months. Plus, we actually use also data from before. So we have like lots of data points also on time where evidence comes from here. Using that first, I'm just reading the comment here, the question. So yeah, we cannot, we do not link the tax data from the revenue authority to the survey data. So we cannot do that just simply for privacy and anonymous for purposes from the ZRA. That was not possible, and also would have been difficult because the survey was done in 2023, and the analysis, especially on the bunching, was in 2017 and 2018. So thus we should see the survey as more as a qualitative view on average how does this work for firms in general. The last question, can result be generalized to other countries? Yes, I think so. So that's something where really I think evidence is required. And currently I'm actually working with the IGC, I mean, with an IGC project on tax compliance of small firms in Rwanda. And actually they have a pretty similar schedule. And what we find is that we do see still bunching also above the threshold. So it's pretty similar facts. So I think these facts are kind of novel, but not only constrained to Zambia, and simply we do not know so much about this. Yeah.
And I guess to the second point of that question, I think sort of, Jenna, you sort of mentioned, I think you've already talked a bit about the different experiences with turnover tax and how it's, can be pretty regressive, especially for smaller firms, and how obviously, there's a big variation. Do you think that these results, could, or like maybe potentially like the bargaining of the results might, be a similar, there might be a similar pattern in other countries in the region?
Yeah, I think there might be a similar pattern in countries that have, I think, similar structured economies as Zambia. I think especially those that are employing a similar method. And I mean, it's interesting to hear Daniel say that that's already something that's starting to reflect itself, right, in some of the existing work. Yeah, I think definitely given sort of the similar capacity of revenue authorities across countries, it is something that I think we potentially can expect to see across the continent.
Thank you very much. And I think we have a question from Shogoto.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I just wanted to take a kind of a broader question and pose it to all of you. So I just wanted to check, like, is the focus on a certain segment of taxpayers, is that sort of a false economy? Should the focus purely be on improving state capacity more broadly through kind of investments in staff training, infrastructure, investments in systems and processes? Just wondering kind of what's the bigger view, like what's the cost benefit, like how should we be thinking about this? Thank you.
I could give a quick shot to that. I think, thanks so much, Sogata. I would actually say that I think it's not an either or. I think this particular piece of research is really, really interesting in understanding taxpayer behavior. And I think just given the significance of particularly sort of the informal economy within African countries, I think this type of research is so important, I think, particularly when thinking about how to raise revenue, but also how taxpayers relate with tax administrations. But I think your second question is important as well, right? And in fact, I think should be where this kind of research leads us, right? Having done this kind of work, where exactly are the entry points that we should be considering with regards to improving the performance of tax administrations, right? So I don't really see it as mutually exclusive. I actually see it as a research that can support both of those two areas that I think are important to interrogate.
Yeah, I mean, I can only second that. That was a great answer.
Elia, do you have any thoughts on the sort of overarching question on the broader picture?
I think from a tax administration perspective, I think the only way we can reduce, for example, these sort of interactions between tax authorities and taxpayers. Number one, like we've discussed, is technology. We need to improve on technology. And two, we need to simplify the laws. Just make them simple that the basic person will understand. No need to use tax agents or middlemen. I know there was a question about the role of tax agents, and then a lot of stakeholder engagements. Just to emphasize, this is something that before policy, we need to have a lot of pre-policy stakeholder engagements. You need to make taxpayers understand why you're introducing this, what's the intention, what are the expectations, and also get realistic views from taxpayers. Because I know I'm going a bit off topic. So we've just recently introduced electronic invoicing. So the idea there is everyone who's on value-added tax needs to onboard onto this system, and we've put strict penalties to non-adherence. So now what we've observed is there's a lot of challenges that are coming. The compliance is affected. The revenues are not doing so good. And a lot of taxpayers have challenges because it requires one to have an updated system in terms of the laptop, high processing, because there's a lot of data that falls in the system. But then our taxpayers are having these challenges. So the question is, did we engage enough to have an understanding of what their needs are? So the most important thing, just to go back to my point, is we need a lot of stakeholder engagement. Yes, the policy intentions may be good, but in the absence of talking to the key stakeholder, the taxpayer in this sense, I think we may not achieve our intended outcomes. I think those are my parting words. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we're in our final minute and we have one final question, which I think maybe we can briefly use as a summary opportunity. So Atale asks, what are the implications of bargaining of tax for policymakers in developing countries? And I think maybe potentially, Chene, would you like to quickly take that?
Yeah. So I mean, I think I'd say we've probably discussed this, but I think the first is sort of that short-term trade-off, right, between
Mm.
sort of revenue collection versus equity, right? So bargaining can help maintain the revenue collection when the enforcement is weak. But I think there's a conversation around, the bargaining power, right, of the taxpayer that you're engaging in. I think the second is it could also have sort of the long-term effect of potentially weakening trust in the tax system, right? Just because the perception, right, of the taxpayer with regards to how this is being employed could have negative implications, right? Particularly for those that, as I mentioned earlier, don't have significant bargaining power. So I think off the top of my head, those are some of the trade-offs and implications of bargaining that one would need to consider.
Thank you so much. Yes, I definitely agree. Trust is something that we haven't maybe just touched on enough, but it's a very big impact. And I think we have a final question, but I think we might have to take this one offline. So as unfortunately we are now at time and we need to close the discussion, I just want to say a huge thank you to our speakers. It's been really, really fascinating hearing all of your various insights. And I think this has really given a lot of additional context to the paper and sort of made it I don't know, I feel like it's made it come alive a little bit. So thank you so much. And thank you to the audience as well for your brilliant questions. We really appreciate all the interaction. And just a quick reminder about the feedback survey. Please do take a minute to fill it out. It could really help us improve our webinar series going forward. And thank you again for everyone. And I look forward to seeing you at our next tax talk, maybe next month. So thank you so much for everyone. Really huge thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Bye-bye. And have a nice rest of the day, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.